Hello, good morning or afternoon, wherever we are in the world. Welcome to the webinar, Reaching Net Zero, Ushering in a Renewable World Order. It's fantastic to see attendees already coming in. It's shooting up right now, up to 200. There's in total 1,400 of you signed up today, so thanks so much for a great response. And thank you in advance to our panelists for our time. I'm Luke Brett from Reuters Events, working on renewable projects, and this is one of several pieces of work we're doing on development on the global renewables sector. Just a brief bit of housekeeping before we begin. The webinar will last an hour and it is being recorded, so we'll send you all the recordings and audio after the discussion. I want this session to be highly interactive, as does Michael, our moderator, so do get those questions coming in the Q&A box. The format for the discussion is Michael Hayes from KPMG will be giving an introduction, then our panelists will introduce themselves. This will be an hour-long just dialogue for an hour. So that's a summary of the details of the discussion. Without further ado, Michael, do you introduce yourself and begin?
Thank you very much, Luke. And as Luke said, good morning and good afternoon to everybody. I know we're joined by participants from all over the world today. Briefly, just to introduce myself, my name is Mike Hayes. I head up KPMG's Global Renewable Practice, and I also act as a climate change and decarbonisation leader. So the topic for discussion today is on net zero in the context of a renewable world order by 2050. And before I introduce the other panelists or let them introduce themselves, just a brief word on the topic. I mean, net zero and somewhat belatedly science-based targets have become very much entered into popular parlance. You know, lots of different views as to what exactly net zero means. And today we're going to focus in on net zero and in particular on the role that renewable energy technologies can play in delivering a net zero future. We're going to hear about, you know, some of the overall comments from the other panelists. We're also going to delve into some of the perspectives from Shell, where one of our panelists works. We're going to talk about the role of hydrogen and natural gas and net zero. So lots of interesting topics. So before we get going with the questions, I'm going to pass first of all to Thierry Calfon from Engie, just to give a brief introduction on himself and Engie.
Okay, thanks, Michael. So good morning and good afternoon to everyone. So very happy to be with you today. So my name is Thierry Calfon, and I'm the managing director of Engie's global renewable business line. So before we start, maybe a few words about Engie and what I do with Engie. So Engie is a 60 billion euro revenue and a 10 billion euro EBITDA global utility, and we have 170,000 staff in 70 countries. We have three main lines of business. First one being low carbon power generation and supply, then gas infrastructures and supply, and the third one is energy efficiency solutions for CNIs. So in this big company, I manage the renewable business globally. So renewables with Engie, it is 28 gigawatts of installed capacities. We are basically active in every technology: wind, onshore and offshore, solar PV, CSP, hydro, biogas, biomass, geothermal, hydrogen, and storage. Our revenues are 2.5 billion euros for an EBIT of around 1 billion euros, and we are roughly 5,000 staff. So last year we commissioned 3 gigawatts of additional capacities, and we have doubled our wind and solar capacities in less than 5 years. Back to you, Michael.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thierry. Stefan Degener from First Solar, I will let you do a brief introduction.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon to everybody on the screen here. My name is Stefan Degener. I'm responsible for First Solar's business in the EMEA region, so Europe, Middle East, and Africa. We are in this region, we are predominantly focused on business development and sales of our module technology. First Solar is a globally leading manufacturer of solar PV modules. Our thin film technology is advanced in terms of energy generation, quality, reliability, and sustainability. We have been active for more than 20 years now. We have more than 25,000 megawatts of our technology installed globally in more than 30 countries in the meantime. And we have been raising more than 17 billion of financing for projects realized by our customers. We are mainly focused on large-scale utility power plants of PV and working with project developers, EPCs, IPPs, and utilities on a global scale.
Thank you, Stefan. And Boris from Shell, I'd like to get a brief introduction from you also, please.
Thanks, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm the general manager for Shell's onshore renewable power development activities, and as part of that role, I sit on the board of Silicon Ranch Corporation here in the US and Cleantech Solar in Singapore, two of our solar platforms in the respective regions. So I'm part of Shell New Energies, and really Shell New Energies is the part of Shell that is driving our activities to make electricity a significant business for Shell, one that in the future could sit alongside of oil, gas, and chemicals, and in that way really helping Shell's portfolio to evolve from an oil and gas company to an all-around energy company.
Okay, thank you very much, Boris. So having had the introductions, I think let's jump into the discussion. And I really want to begin just having a general discussion on net zero and what it means. And Thierry, I'm going to start off with you. A very simple question to begin with, but what actions do you think are needed to achieve net zero?
Okay, thanks, Michael. So first of all, there's no doubt that the race to net zero has really started. It seems that everybody is now lining up on the start line. This is the case for governments. They have even started putting their money where their mouth is. For instance, a significant fraction of post-COVID recovery plans will be channeled into transition investments. But what is certainly more important is what we are currently seeing from companies. There's not a single day without a company committing to the net zero pathway, not only in the energy sector, but also in chemicals, cement, mining, construction, services, bank, finance. So that being said, what does it take to achieve net zero? So I think there's now a very wide consensus around three pillars to get to this objective. The first one being energy efficiency, then electrification, and then green gases. Energy efficiency, when you read the different analyses, can find that global energy demand will need to slow down by 1.2% per annum, which is 30% slower than 30 years, than over the past 30 years. So this will, of course, call for a massive reduction in GDP and energy intensity, as in some parts of the world, demand for power is going to increase. Then the second pillar is fuel switching to electricity. They say that 80% of transport, heat, and industry will need to shift to electricity. And in turn, the power used by those sectors will need to come from renewables. Then renewable and decarbonized gases, biomethane and hydrogen. So first, let me emphasize that in the short term, non-renewable fossil gas, I mean natural gas, is of course already contributing to a cost-effective reduction in CO2 emissions. And this is obviously the case whenever natural gas replaces coal in electricity generation, when natural gas replaces oil in heating, or even diesel and petrol in transportation. But what is really granted is that this natural gas will need in the medium term to turn green. And this natural gas will need to be progressively replaced by biomethane, hydrogen, or even e-methane. And this is because those green gases are not fossil, because they offer effective solutions to complement renewable energy sources, and because they contribute to the security of supply. But let me finish on this. For those three engines to work properly, meaning electrification, green gases, and energy efficiency, there are a number of additional conditions to be met. First, electrification means massive development of renewables in the 30 years to come, and with probably a peak in the next decade. So it is assessed that around 600 gigawatts of new build every year will be needed. Last year it was 180 gigawatts. Huh? It will, of course, need a further drop in renewable generation costs. And on the whole, it's estimated that this will lead to around $500 billion capex spend per year on average over the 2020-2050 period. So these $500 billion can be compared with what was spent last year, which was around $300 billion. The second one is that electrification also means considerable storage and grid investments. And this will be required to ensure stability of the grid, and that despite of high renewable penetration. And last, and this one is very important, this will require a new global market design. As you know, renewables have very low marginal costs, so wholesale power prices will go down substantially in systems with high renewable penetration. So power markets at some point will need redesigning to complement the merchant price signal with something else, like for instance a capacity remuneration scheme. And this new global market design will of course also need to be supported by effective CO2 pricing. So all in all, energy economists are saying that between 3% to 5% of global GDP will need to be spent in the energy transition in the 30 years to come, which is of course considerable, but still achievable.
Thank you, Thierry. I mean, there's lots of interesting points there. I'm going to specifically come back to the hydrogen point in a couple of minutes. And I think one of the important points you've made is just the size of investment required to achieve these objectives. However, I'd like to go back to something you said at the very start about energy efficiency. I often think it's the overlooked area in the energy transition. Can you tell me, do you think that do corporations really understand the benefits that energy efficiency can bring, not just in terms of reducing carbon footprint, but also actually in delivering real cost savings?
I really think so. Actually, we have a full line of business which is fully dedicated to providing energy efficiency solutions to CNIs, to commercial and industrials. And a big part of our business is done through energy efficiency contracts with companies. So they are more and more eager to go for this, especially in industrial sectors which are very hard to abate with regard to CO2 emissions, like steel, for instance, or sectors for which energy consumption accounts for a large part of the value added.
Okay, thank you. Stefan, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, First Solar is a name I've known in the solar business for many, many years, from certainly when I started looking at solar in the United States. And I keep hearing about the future of solar. It looks really promising. Can you just talk to us about the place you believe solar will play in the transition to net zero?
Yeah, absolutely. So Thierry just mentioned the importance of electrification. I think this is key, and solar power is a contributor and is a generator of electricity. So the industry focusing on improving the quality, the reliability, and the efficiency of the product. And when I talk about efficiency, it's the conversion efficiency of sunlight into electricity. So the R&D spend in the industry has doubled between 2013, where it spent $500 million globally, to 1.1 billion spent by in 2018. So you see that there is massive effort. First Solar alone has spent a cumulative $1 billion over the past decade into R&D to improve our product and to make it more reliable. The reliability is key for the plant owners and operators. Have it been 20 years of project lifetime in the past, when we were in feed-in tariff worlds, we now see that our customers are planning an operational lifetime of up to 40 years. So it's important for them to get a product delivered which is meeting expectations in terms of energy generation, but also is a low OPEX asset. As we just said, marginal costs are very low, so you don't want to spend very much on the O&M side of it. The other thing, what comes into the view more recently is also the carbon footprint focus. While the operation of a solar PV plant does not generate or emit any CO2, we are focusing on the manufacturing side. So really being serious about the use of resources, being it energy, being it water, making sure that the carbon footprint of a delivered product is really at the lowest score possible. Thin film PV offers this opportunity, and with that we are also driving towards the net zero world. So that's on the manufacturing side. When we look downstream, we see more and more that project development is becoming smart. Was it about developing a project pretty fast and getting it grid connected in the past? Today, our customers are looking on biodiversity. They are taking care of the natural resources. And we have plenty of examples where a solar PV asset on a site which has been used previously for monocultural agribusiness and which exhausted the ground and the soil significantly, that a solar power plant can even improve the biodiversity on such sites by allowing a species to come back to find their homes there and improve the overall biodiversity. And then last but not least, it's looking at the end of life of the module, but of the entire power plant. As I said, it has been 20 years, it's moving further down the line, but there is some point where the projects need to be repowered, where the existing material needs to be recycled. And that's what we have been focusing on very much in order to develop solutions and run solutions which are in compliance with current regulations as we have it with the WEEE directive in Europe, and which is now emerging everywhere else in the world. So the WEEE directive, for example, covers the decommissioning cost at the end of the lifetime of a solar PV asset, which is a massive step forward compared to what we see with nuclear or coal assets in the field today, where the social community has to cover the cost of the decommissioning. So this all together, in my view, is a great contribution of the solar industry value chain to reaching net zero and to get that accelerated as we move ahead.
Thanks, Stefan. Some really interesting points there, and I see you're already generating lots of technical questions, which we'll come back to at the end of the session.
Sure.
Boris, I want to turn to you, and I want to turn to a corporate story. I mean, we keep hearing about, you know, institutions like the European Union, governments talking about net zero, but for me, it's actually the corporate commitments that are probably really going to make a difference. particularly in the oil and gas sector, and Shell, I think, has been at the forefront. So can you elaborate on exactly what Shell intends to do to get to its commitment of net zero by 2050?
Sure. And maybe from a calibration perspective, we use the term net zero here, but basically, fundamentally in tackling climate change, right? So the world is likely to need to stop adding to the stock of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and that's what we all call net zero emissions. And of course, Shell supports this ambition and supporting this in step with society. So how do we approach that? In simple terms, we look at it in three ways, and that's really along the scopes. Right? So first, we are taking account for our own operations and the energy we ourselves consume, and we need to be and we seek to be net zero on all these emissions from manufacturing of our own products by 2050 at the latest. That is step one. However, the vast majority is really around the products that we make for customers. Right? We plan to reduce that net carbon footprint of our own energy products by selling more products with a lower carbon intensity, such as biofuels or hydrogen, but quite importantly, and that's where I play in the bigger picture, is the renewable power part. Right? So we heard it from Thierry, we heard it from Stefan, that really the electrification and the clean electrification, specifically around onshore wind, offshore wind, solar is really a main driver there. However, finally, as the third step, and while society moves then towards a low carbon future, our customers will also need to mitigate emissions and costs by their energy use. And that's really where we collaborate with the customers to decarbonize and by working with them to address the emissions. But this is something we see as an effort that is really done within a broad coalition. This is business, government, and other parties, where we really, on a sector-by-sector basis, need to identify and enable that decarbonization to get a unique pathway for every single sector, be it industry, be it transport, to arrive at that 2050 goal.
And do you mind if I ask, Boris, if carbon offsets play a part in the Shell strategy for net zero?
So we have published our Shell Sky scenario, and we have modeled these pathways, be it for 2070, be it for 2050, and we see clearly carbon offsets as part of the solution.
Right. Okay. And very much in the news at the moment, and people are looking at new carbon offset models. So that's very useful from all of you in terms of setting the scene and some of the challenges, but also some of the very proactive things we can do to reach net zero. I want to touch for a minute and put a question to all of you on the policy environment. I think, Thierry, or you refer to some of the stimulus packages, and we're seeing all of the COVID recovery packages really is part of, not all of them, being labeled as green recovery packages. We've seen it from the European Union, we've seen it from multiple different countries around the world. Can I get a sense from all of you if you think there's a lot more to be done on the policy environment to help you all reach your individual objectives of reaching net zero by 2050?
Yeah, I don't mind.
Go ahead.
I can start on that. So we as a company are working directly and also through associations to create the awareness for improvements which need to be made. Looking into Europe, where we work with the Association Solar Power Europe, it's that we need a more harmonized energy market design. We need more harmonized grids in order to make the resources which are available more efficient, and to have the best use of land, of grid access, and then wind and sun as the energy resources. As I said before, promoting the idea of ultra-low carbon technology will also allow the EU to drive decarbonization on manufacturing globally. And that supports to the recently introduced carbon border tax idea and all of that. And then Yeah, last but not least, the financing side is always a hot topic, as financing costs determine roughly 40% of the LCOE of a renewable asset. So recently, the EU said that the EIB should be mandated to be the provider of green financing. We want to open the EIB for low-cost financing for the entire value chain of renewables, not only for the projects, but also for the manufacturing, in order to support the respective industry strategies we all have on the renewable side.
Okay, I fully agree with Stefan. If I may add a couple of points. First of all, there's money flowing into the system. At least in Europe, there's private money because the cost of money is very cheap, and there's more and more public money, and on this. We need to acknowledge that the European recovery plan is significant, and especially significant for energy transition. The EU recovery plan is 750 billion euros, out of which there's going to be 30% spent on climate actions. And what is interesting is that out of those 750, there will be more than 300 billion euros spent on subsidies, so not refundable, not loans. And the most important for us is that this money will be spent quickly. So there's a commitment that this money is going to be spent by 2024 at the latest. But there are challenges as well. And the most important one for us is the time which is needed to permit a project. To get permits in Europe, it's between 5 to 7 years. It's a very long time. So we need a kind of a simplification shock so that it's easier to develop and permit the projects. And in some countries, we need to simplify the processes to get connection to the grids as well. So a lot of money. Think that European policymakers have become serious about supporting energy transition, but what we need is to be better in land access, interconnections, and project permitting.
Thank you, Thierry.
Sorry, Boris,
to what Thierry just said, right? So it's about this, what kind of policy framework helps with a fast and effective and affordable transition. And I think it's important to point out that this will only work if you look at this from an operating the complete energy system as a whole. Right? So this is about links across multiple energy carriers. That is about infrastructure, and it's again about the consumption of those sectors. We just recently published what we call a scenario sketch, which is a specific view on a specific topic derived out of our wider Shell scenario work. And we looked at what could a path look like for a climate neutral EU by 2050. And really to build on Thierry and Stefan's point, if you look at the 4 dimensions there, just a couple of numbers. You would need to have an electrification that goes from 20% today to 60% by 2050. You would need to assume that biofuels triple in 2020 and 2050. Energy efficiency would need to improve by 45% from today to 2050. And finally, which I think we will touch later, is really from a clean hydrogen perspective, you would need to assume that 10% of the final energy use will be hydrogen, and you would have approximately 1 million hydrogen trucks on the road by 2050. And just to show a bit of the dimension and the size of the task at hand. And from that perspective, I think it's really important to remind ourselves it's not about a single solution, right? It's truly about the combination of the energy system as a whole to get us through that transition. And that's really where policy framework comes in.
But Boris, I couldn't agree with you more. People miss this point. I meet people in offshore wind who say it's the future. I meet the same people like Stefan with solar, but it's the mix of these different technologies. And personally, I look to governments to help us on policy. Yes, they can be part of the capital solution, but there's lots of money there. But the focus for me with governments is policy. I really welcome the various initiatives that are coming out of the EU Green Deal. And Thierry made a really important point. They want to deploy this type of support quickly, which is going to be important. And we have to get over some of the previous ways we had of dispersing money, whether it was grants, loans, or subsidies. It's too slow. And also, just to reinforce the point I think Thierry made about the time it takes to develop projects, we are not going to get to net zero with that current system. And it's the same more or less in each country. So at this stage of the session, I'm going to turn very much to focus onto the hydrogen question. Hydrogen and natural gas, I mean, it's come up in multiple sort of discussion points during the last 30 minutes or so. And we'll try and refine this to about 10 or 15 minutes. But Thierry, I'll start with you. I mean, you started to develop a hydrogen discussion. We all were very much aware of the blue versus green hydrogen debate. We're very much aware of the potential of hydrogen. How realistic is a hydrogen economy in the short term?
First of all, we really think that we will need what we call green gases to get to the pathway to net zero. And green gases is not only hydrogen, but biomethane as well. Why do we need those two gases, and hydrogen in particular? Because those gases will be critical to provide cost-effective solutions to ensure the flexibility which is badly needed in a fully decarbonized power system. So hydrogen, for instance, will be used at some point in power generation. Hydrogen to power through fuel cells, but this will be the case also for biomethane. Biomethane can be used and will be used to generate power through the retrofitting of CCGTs. Hydrogen, of course, will need to be used for storage and especially interseasonal storage, and storage of rest power through water electrolysis. And but we'll come back to that afterwards. I think what is good is that everybody starts considering that hydrogen is going to have a pivotal role in the zero carbon system through its different usages: feedstock, heavy duty mobility, storage, power generation, and things are changing quickly now.
Okay. Boris, if I could turn to you, an organization like Shell, given your background in oil and gas, hydrogen must clearly be central part of your focus for net zero.
So clearly, hydrogen will have, well, we talked about earlier, right? So there's the hydrogen, now it's all the rage. I think it's important. We have been looking into hydrogen really for years, and we've been educating around the benefits. So for us, clearly, hydrogen is a core part of the mix, of the energy mix of the future, and to a successful transitioning. We are involved in construction of electrolysis plant in our Rhineland refinery in Wesseling in Germany that will produce hydrogen using renewable energy. Right? And so from this perspective, we really see this as a huge opportunity and clearly committed development.
If I can jump in just to complement what I was saying, and I fully support what Boris was saying. Hydrogen has been talked about for years, and some of us have been badly burnt by thinking a bit too early that hydrogen will change the energy systems. But there's something which is really new about the hydrogen economy, and which has happened recently, that there is now not too far away horizon when green and blue hydrogens become competitive. And this was not the case in the past. So most analysts agree today that this competitiveness of hydrogen, I mean clean hydrogen, so green and blue, this might happen as early as 2030, which is tomorrow. And even some say that by 2050, green hydrogen will have a generation cost lower than $1 per kilogram, so cheaper than gray. And this is really due to a number of factors that did not happen beforehand. The first one is that we have come to a point when renewable generation has become cheap and is going to get cheaper and cheaper. And you need to remember that 70% of the generation cost of green hydrogen comes from renewable supply. Then manufacturing costs are getting down quickly now. When you take a look at the electrolyzer costs, they have really plummeted over the past years. Alkaline minus 40% and PEM minus 50%. And what is interesting is that the average unit size of new electrolyzers, this size has gone up by a factor 10, from 0.1 megawatt 5 years ago to 1 megawatt today. So there's the beginning of scaling up an industrialization process of hydrogen, which makes us much more confident in the hydrogen economy than we used to be before. And this is the reason why 3 years ago we decided to create business units fully dedicated to hydrogen, but we can come back to that afterwards.
Great. No, thank you, Thierry. I spend a lot of my time working with investors, both debt and equity investors, and they've been very prominent in supporting the renewable energy industry for many years. One of the things that I'm finding really fascinating is a willingness for those investors to at least dip their toe into the hydrogen economy, which is a sign that they support what you said, that it may not be there today in terms of cost, but it's coming, and investors want to be part of the journey, which I think will be very positive. Okay. I want to just move, there's so many different dimensions, and I can see there's just so many different questions coming in, and we'll try and get to them, but please bear with us. Stefan, I want to come back to you and to the solar debate. So we've discussed hydrogen, but solar to me seems like, it's such an easy solution. You've got the cost down so dramatically over the last number of years. I started off looking at concentrated solar many years ago, and then I've seen just with PV, just the dramatic changes. What do you think are the big barriers to solar continuing this rapid scale up globally, not just in some of the obvious countries, but I see solar as a really important solution in emerging markets also?
Yeah, thanks for this very interesting question, Michael. So it's right. We have seen a dramatic decline of cost of the technology itself, but more importantly, of the cost per kilowatt hour. And we now see that some bits are being allocated below 2 cents per kilowatt hour already in the Middle East or Europe. So that makes us all very hopeful. However, I think Boris talked about the dimension of new investments we need to face over the next several years, or was it Terry? I don't know exactly, but we are talking about multiple hundreds of gigawatts of new generation capacity to be built. Solar being the cheapest, but not always the one of choice. But if we look at solar, we need to remove administrative and technical barriers. It's still that energy markets everywhere are highly regulated. And this regulation is very unreliable and unstable. And this is the point where we need to work collectively with the policymakers, with the regulators, them to understand if they the right kind of guidelines and guardrails for the industry, then it will work, and the industry and investors will come up delivering against these expectations. But this is really one of the core things we have been struggling with in the past. The other thing is land availability and land access. It doesn't work without getting the land and getting grid access for renewable power plants in order to support the system. So that's on the administrative and technical side. What we are seeing more and more, I think wind is more exposed to it, but we see it on the solar side now as well, is this what we call NIMBYism. So there's a general mindset that I think most of the people globally agree that we need to move to the net zero world and to renewables, but nobody wants to have a generator, a solar asset, or a wind turbine, or even a grid in his backyard. And this is where we need to get to this kind of prosumer sentiment and mindset that everybody, on the one hand, has the opportunity to involve himself, being at the rooftop system or becoming an investor, and helping to drive it instead of being against everything in the world. And this is more relevant to the more saturated and mature economies like in Europe or the US, and as we are seeing it in emerging markets, but we foresee that this will come there as well. We need political stakeholders to align, and to overcome a very local or regional thinking rather than a holistic thinking of this new energy system where all the sectors are being coupled together, where we are driving the electrification, where we're combining heat and transport into it, and finding the most effective and efficient way to get to net zero by 2050, or hopefully earlier. A big risk on this is that the elimination of fossil subsidies is still going way too slow. We see that some of the global conflicts are still around fossil energy. We still see that the exploration and the use of fossil fuels is still being subsidized by governments, and that needs to stop in order to support the global mindset of driving to low carbon, to net zero economies. Being it through carbon pricing, being it to support in investments into the clean thing. I think that's these are the most important topics we need to work on in order to get to the multiple hundred gigawatts of installations every year.
So I want to just come back to all the panelists, and thank you for that, Stefan. You've raised lots of interesting points there. All of you have spoken about this question of subsidies and new subsidies from the European Union, subsidies for fossil fuels, and I'm reflecting some comments I'm picking up on the Q&A as well with this question. To what extent do we need to figure out how to repeat the success with the investment community with wind and solar? We came to the investment market over 20 years ago presenting a very clear model under which debt and equity investors could participate. There was a lot of comfort taken from the subsidy model, and we proved what we said day one, that we would let these industries mature with the support of subsidies, and that has happened. You now find the investment community more than willing to participate in unsubsidized projects. But here on this discussion, we're talking about new technologies. We're talking about hydrogen. I could equally talk about floating offshore wind. We could talk about batteries. Do you think we need to sort of, going back to the policy question, rethink the subsidy question and find ways to give some early stage policy support in the form of subsidies to these newer technologies in order to encourage further investment?
So maybe I think what's really important when we look at the success that we've seen in renewable power going through this transition, right? So from the highly subsidized, what was it, 40 cents per kilowatt hour at some point in time, feed-in tariffs, to a world where we now operate in, as you said, unsubsidized markets. Not only is there a shift from subsidized to non-subsidized markets happening, what's actually evolving, and it comes back to Thierry's earlier point, the dramatic cost reduction on that side. It's not only about the proof of concept from a technology perspective, but it's really getting into the territory where you can leave the subsidies behind, because you get from a mandate environment into a true customer-led environment. So on renewable power, when you think about additionality, when you think about customers creating the pull, creating the demand for renewable power, that was really what we were able to achieve in that shift from highly subsidized feed-in tariffs to truly market forces at work. So when you think about the shift to getting to this customer-led economy around renewable power, we heard earlier Stefan talk about the barriers in solar where it's about seasonality, and Thierry mentioned that of course hydrogen can play a major role in managing that seasonality. I do believe while some of the technology might see support needed, however, we are already with some of the pieces of the puzzle of the renewable power picture, where we are in customer-led territory, where the new technology can be added to already viable projects. Think about retrofit of storage. Think about PV plus storage, where your PV project itself, with added storage capability, increases the value of your product as a developer. So I think for me, it is for us to be quite careful around where do we really, as society, need subsidy in order to get the jump start for new technologies to deploy, and where is the existing trend, the existing momentum helping us to create the pull for the new technology. But happy to get Stefan and Thierry's point on that.
I fully agree, but let's face it, for some technologies, subsidies, government support still needed. There's no investor or developer today who can really develop a hydrogen project for feedstock for industrial processes on a pure merchant basis. This is plainly impossible. And I mean, governments know that, and this is the reason why in all the recovery plans which were announced in France last week, in Germany last June, there's a significant chunk of this which is dedicated to hydrogen. And to me, I think this money, this taxpayer money, is money well spent, because it can really trigger the establishment of a new industrial filière in hydrogen in Europe. And as we all said it, hydrogen will be a key brick, a key variable in the future net zero equation. But subsidies are needed for hydrogen for some time. And it may be that in 2030 or in 2040, no subsidies anymore would be needed, but we need them right now.
Right. No, thank you, Thierry, and I completely agree. And I think we should involve the investment community more in actually figuring out what type of subsidies are going to work, because let's learn from the successes and the failures of the past 20 years. We're running out of time, but there's one specific area, Boris, I wanted to come back and talk to you about, and it's Shell, and not just Shell itself, but I'd like you to just talk a little bit about the work Shell is doing to encourage and enable net zero objectives through its supply chain, and in particular with its customers.
Sure. So maybe I mentioned earlier that on the new energies, as part of Shell and our aim to make electricity a significant business for Shell, we've really over the last 4 years, once we started new energies, have made a couple of investments that I think really paints the picture on what we are building and trying to achieve for our customers. And I just want to pick a couple of those. I mentioned earlier, I sit on the board of Silicon Ranch and Cleantech, two solar companies, onshore renewables here in the US and Singapore. we are quite active in offshore wind, Borssele 3 and 4 wind farm in the Netherlands. We have offshore wind leases, and really we are focusing on increasing the amount of electricity that we can directly supply to commercial and industrial customers. So here in the US, we have MP2 Energy out of Houston. We have acquired ERM Power in Australia, and for the listeners in UK, rebranded as Shell Energy Retail. Now we have, of course, First Utility as part of our product offering. That is just on the pure power side. So we look at this from a wider lens. When you zoom out, you touch on e-mobility, and you touch on e-mobility and grid support, where we have here in the US, in California-based Green Lots, which is providing charging points. In the Netherlands, we have New Motion with their vehicle charging network. And from an energy storage perspective, which we touched on earlier as well, we have Sonnen, the Germany-based company. We bought them in 2019. So why are we acquiring and investing in all those different companies? And that's really, we look at it from a core. We see this as a transition and as an enabling of customer choice. What options can we provide to help customers to achieve their carbon ambitions? And that's where we really approach it from 3 different steps. How can we help avoid emissions? How can we help reduce emissions? And last but not least, how can we compensate for emissions? And on the avoid emissions, that's of course maximizing the role of renewables. That's really where we see a building around additionality. And when we talk about additionality, clearly we talk about a revenue contract with a customer that creates the reason to build a PV farm, to build a wind farm. Right? So to not use existing hydro, but bring new additional renewables into the mix. So that's really the part where we talk about this avoid emissions. From a reduce emissions perspective, and Terry had commented on that earlier, that's really where we think about where can you help transition away from coal and diesel and get into go into natural gas. Right? So as one of the cleanest burning hydrocarbons, and really then looking into renewable solutions like biomethane. Right? So that's all part of the reduction of the emission piece. Right? And last but not least, when you think about the parts where you cannot avoid or reduce today, you can really work on credits like emissions reduction projects that compensate for unavoidable emissions. So it's really this complete view on the avoid, reduce, and compensate emissions part that we bring into the conversations with our existing and with new customers. And in order to do so, we have built that ecosystem of partners and companies that can really truly help with the electrification of the different sectors.
Thank you, Boris. I'm going to move into the Q&A piece now, but just very quickly, just a brief word from each of our 3 panelists. Do we actually think this ambition of net zero by 2050 is realistic based on what we know today? Thierry, I'll start with you. We've lost you, Thierry.
Sorry. What I wanted to say that no doubt we will. We will because we have no alternative option. This is the first reason. And the second one is that there's a very strong push everywhere towards making it happen. Why did ENGIE turn around our strategy 5 years ago to put energy transition at the center of our strategy? It's not only because it's good for the planet, because just plainly our customers want us to do that. And the talent that we hire, they expect us to do this. So if we don't do that, we don't have business any longer. So we are doing that. And the last reason why I think we will get to it is that more and more this energy transition is competitive and affordable. So we don't have to choose anymore between the end of the month and the end of the world, as the yellow jerseys used to say when they demonstrated in the streets of Paris 1 year ago. I mean, we can get to it. So I'm very optimistic that we'll make it.
Great. Stefan, just a brief word from you.
Yeah, I'm not only hopeful, I'm convinced that we can make it, at least by 2050, hopefully earlier. Some studies show that it's possible. There's good news attached to it. The industry is ready and willing. We need more innovation, we need more willingness to collaborate and bring things forward and help and subsidize where it's needed, but leave the market decide about the best use of on the energy mix. And the good news is, as a study from the Energy Watch Group showed last year, that in a 100% renewable system by 2050, we will have 35 million people employed in the energy space. It was 20 million in 2015 alone in power generation. So there's a growth in jobs, and that's what is needed as well to take care of the social responsibility the energy side has.
Boris?
Well, adding and amplifying what Thierry and Stefan said, I think it's about a broad coalition. It's about the energy system as a whole, and it's really about finding solutions for different sectors to be where they need to be at the point in time to help us collectively get through the energy transition.
Great. No, thank you all. We have 4 minutes left, so we have got a phenomenal number of questions, both in the Q&A and in the chat. So I'm going to be very brief, and I'm just going to try and pick up on some of the themes, and I've done so already in some of my questions. 1 or 2 questions on offshore wind, which we haven't discussed. Do we all agree that offshore wind is going to be a critical part of the future generation mix, and it's a particular part of the sector that's likely to grow exponentially over the next 10 years?
Yes, yeah, I agree, and especially floating.
Interesting. We're in violent agreement again, Thierry, so thank you for that. Boris, this is probably a question for you on reporting. When will all energy players begin to disclose all scope 1, 2, and 3 CO2 emissions?
You're asking me about a forward-looking statement on our reporting activities. That's a nice one to end this at. So look, at the end of the day, this all has to happen in lockstep with society, and it has to happen in an agreed upon framework, and it has to happen reliable across the board. And clearly we are part of society and part of those activities to get us to a transparent reporting.
Thank you. A couple of questions on the challenges around distribution and transmission, and the fact that our infrastructure in that area is vastly behind where it should be. I presume you all would say that's an incredibly important area, but probably an area that's been lacking in focus from governments for too long now.
Yeah,
well, I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
Stefan, go on.
Okay, so yes, it has been. It hasn't had the priority in the past what it needed to have. We now see that some good initiatives have been started. On the other hand, we also have to look at the value what renewable assets can bring. There is significant improvement on these assets in regards to providing grid services and stabilizing the grid and not disturbing it. So this has been changing over the past few years significantly. So again, here collaboration between the generation side and the transmission and distribution side is needed, required to get to effective solutions.
Thanp you.
Maybe Michael, just adding on that, I think it's important to acknowledge, right? So we talk about systems that have been designed and built to operate for 40, 50, 60 years. And as we are in the energy transition, we will see new systems and upgrades on systems while we are changing from a more centralized power system to a more decentralized power system. But clearly, this is not like an iPhone that that has a lifetime of 2, 3, 4 years. We're talking about decades. I think we just need to be focusing on what is happening in an incremental change to the power grid, as opposed to having a look at the absolute mileage of power grid deployed.
Just a small add-on on this, I mean, you cannot talk about grid and grid support without mentioning storage. They go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Yep, agree. I think we're out of time, and I know Luke is looking to come back in. So I just want to say two things. First of all, there's two areas I'd love to have spent more time on, which is innovation, and lots of questions about innovation and how innovators can be supported, which those of you who know me is a subject I feel really passionate about. And secondly, emerging markets. We only touched on some key points in emerging markets, and it's probably requires a whole session by itself. So apologies we couldn't get to all of these really important areas. I'd like to finish by thanking Thierry, Boris, and Stefan for some really interesting observations and insights. And hopefully our audience got some value from today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks a lot, Michael, particularly as well for hosting the questions, and of course to all our panelists. We obviously want to keep the discussions going. You'll have the full audio replay within a week. We'll be uploading it onto YouTube and sending it across to you all. Do share this with all your colleagues, because we want to, as I said, keep these dialogues going. And thanks again for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.